I would say that President Putin is not afraid of Europe. He's afraid of the United States of America, as led by me.
President Vladimir Putin and his top general claim they successfully tested a nuclear-powered cruise missile.
Vladimir Putin cares too much if he's getting condemned this afternoon at the United Nations, but he clearly was sending a message with this hypersonic missile.
Russia's action now risks expanding the war.
Germany confirmed in September 2025 that U.S. Army forces are activating a long-range fires battalion at Wiesbaden, and by January 2026, the 3-12 Field Artillery Battalion is operational with 540 soldiers manning Typhoon launchers capable of firing Tomahawk cruise missiles with 2,000-kilometer ranges that can reach deep into Russian territory from German soil. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov warned that Moscow would respond with military measures to this new threat. And Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov stated bluntly that European capitals hosting these missiles are now potential victims of Russian strikes, recreating Cold War confrontation where intermediate-range missiles position both sides for rapid escalation. But here's what nobody anticipated. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius formally requested to purchase Typhoon systems in July 2025. Meaning Germany itself will soon operate American cruise missiles independently rather than just hosting U.S. forces. And when you combine German-operated Typhoons with the U.S. Army battalion already deploying and factor in developmental hypersonic weapons arriving in 2026 that can reach Moscow in under 10 minutes, Russia faces a scenario where NATO conventional precision strikes could destroy Russian nuclear forces before Moscow even confirms an attack is underway, compressing decision timelines to the point where automated launch-on-warning systems might trigger nuclear war based on sensor data rather than human judgment. The Typhoon system represents a fundamental shift in European military balance that most people completely misunderstand because the technical capabilities sound abstract until you map what they actually mean on the ground. The Typhoon launcher uses a modified Mk-41 vertical launch system mounted on trucks, the same launchers U.S. Navy destroyers use, adapted for land-based mobile deployment that makes them nearly impossible for Russian intelligence to track once dispersed across German territory. The system fires both SM-6 missiles with approximately 500-kilometer range and Tomahawk cruise missiles reaching up to 2,000 kilometers, creating layered strike capabilities where SM-6s can hit targets in western Russia, including Kaliningrad, while Tomahawks can penetrate to Moscow, St. Petersburg, strategic bomber bases, ballistic missile storage sites, and command bunkers throughout Russia's European territories. What makes this genuinely dangerous is the mobility factor. These aren't fixed missile silos that Russian planners can pre-target. These are truck-mounted launchers that can drive to firing positions, launch within minutes, and immediately relocate before Russian counterstrikes arrive, creating a distributed threat that Russian air defenses cannot effectively counter because the launchers could be anywhere within hundreds of kilometers of potential firing positions at any given moment. The US and Germany announced in July 2024 that deployment would begin in 2026 as episodic rotations planning for enduring stationing in the future, and that timeline is now materializing exactly as planned. The U.S. Army activated the 3-12 Field Artillery Battalion in October 2025, initially with 240 soldiers growing to a final strength of 540 personnel, and the formation is currently receiving HIMARS rocket artillery, Typhoon launchers, and hypersonic missiles that will give NATO unprecedented conventional strike depth into Russian territory. Colonel Jeffrey Pickler, who commands the 2nd Multi-Domain Task Force near Wiesbaden, confirmed that HIMARS rocketry is closest to delivery, with Typhoon systems and hypersonic weapons following in sequence, creating a phased buildup where NATO's long-range strike capabilities in Europe will expand dramatically throughout 2026. What nobody's openly discussing is how this interacts with Russia's nuclear doctrine. Russian military strategy explicitly reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to conventional attacks that threaten Russian nuclear forces or state survival, and when NATO positions conventional precision missiles that can destroy Russian ICBMs, strategic bombers, and ballistic missile submarines in their bases before they can launch, Moscow interprets that as creating conditions for a disarming first strike that undermines Russia's nuclear deterrent entirely. Russia's response has been immediate and escalatory in ways suggesting Moscow views this as existential threat rather than manageable deterrence. Russian President Vladimir Putin stated in July 2024 that Russia would adopt mirror measures and consider itself free from a unilateral moratorium on intermediate-range missile deployments if NATO proceeds with Typhoon stationing in Germany, explicitly warning that Russia would resume production and deployment of ground-launched cruise missiles and ballistic missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, that the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty banned from 1988 until the treaty collapsed in 2019. Kremlin spokesperson Peskov warned that European capitals are potential victims if they host U.S. missiles, directly threatening NATO capitals including Berlin, Warsaw, and Paris with Russian strikes, and Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov promised Russia would respond without nerves, without emotions, with military countermeasures, language typically preceding actual weapons deployments rather than empty rhetoric. Russian officials haven't specified exact countermeasures, but options include deploying Iskander-M missiles with nuclear warheads to Kaliningrad and Belarus, positioning SSC-8 ground-launched cruise missiles closer to NATO borders, or even replicating Cuban missile crisis dynamics by deploying Russian intermediate-range missiles to Cuba or Venezuela within striking distance of American territory, creating symmetric threats that would force Washington to experience the same compressed decision timelines and vulnerability that NATO's Typhoon deployment creates for Moscow. What makes this crisis fundamentally more dangerous than 1980s Euromissile confrontations is how modern precision-guided weapons and emerging hypersonic technologies compress warning times below thresholds where human decision-making can prevent accidental escalation. The joint U.S.-German statement explicitly mentioned developmental hypersonic weapons as part of the 2026 deployment package, referring to the U.S. Army's long-range hypersonic weapons system, currently in testing that travels at speeds exceeding Mach 5 and maneuvers unpredictably during flight to evade missile defenses. When hypersonic weapons launch from Germany toward Russian targets, flight times could shrink to 8 to 10 minutes for Western Russian military installations, compared to 30-minute flight times for subsonic Tomahawk cruise missiles, creating scenarios where Russian early warning systems detect launches, alert commanders, and Russian leadership faces impossible decisions with literally minutes before impact. Is this a conventional strike against Russian conventional forces that requires conventional military response? Or is this the opening salvo of a NATO nuclear first strike designed to destroy Russian strategic weapons before they can retaliate, requiring immediate nuclear launch on warning before confirmation that dooms Russia's deterrent if the warning is real? These impossible dilemmas under extreme time pressure are exactly the conditions where accidents, miscalculations, technical failures, or deliberate escalation by rogue commanders could trigger nuclear war that neither side's political leadership actually wanted. The geographic and strategic context amplifies these dangers because NATO expansion has fundamentally altered military balance in ways that validate Russian threat perceptions about encirclement, even if Western officials dismiss them as paranoia. Finland joined NATO in April 2023, adding 1,340 kilometers of NATO-Russia border and positioning alliance territory within 150 kilometers of St. Petersburg, and Sweden joined in March 2024, turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO-controlled body of water where Russian naval forces from Kaliningrad and Baltic fleet bases operate under constant surveillance from multiple alliance members. From Moscow's perspective, the combination of NATO expansion bringing alliance borders to Russian doorsteps, increased European defense spending, forward deployment of NATO troops to Poland and Baltic states, and now positioning of long-range precision strike missiles in Germany represents comprehensive encirclement strategy, creating conditions for potential NATO first strike against Russian nuclear forces. And while Western analysts argue this misreads NATO's defensive intentions, the objective military geography supports Russian assessments that NATO now possesses capabilities to strike throughout Russia's European territory from multiple axes with minimal warning, undermining Russia's strategic depth and forcing reliance on early launch protocols that increase nuclear war risks. Germany's pursuit of Typhoon demonstrates how serious Berlin views the Russian threat, despite domestic political controversy about hosting American missiles. Defense Minister Pistorius confirmed during his July 2025 Washington visit that Germany submitted a formal purchase request, marking major shift in German security policy after decades of reluctance to deploy offensive strike weapons on German soil. According to Pistorius, acquiring Typhoon would counterbalance missile capabilities Russia already fields and signal Germany's intent to reinforce NATO deterrence. And German officials frame this as defensive response to Russia's Iskander-M deployments in Kaliningrad that already threaten German territory with nuclear-capable missiles. But there's strategic calculation beyond pure defense. Germany chose Typhoon over joining France's LCM program for developing European long-range missiles, prioritizing immediate American capabilities over slower multilateral European programs. And Russian analysts fear this signals U.S. strategy of selling Typhoon to European allies, while maintaining plausible deniability through rotating American personnel for training, while systems remain permanently stationed on European soil under host nation flags. Lockheed Martin is under contract to produce 4 Typhoon batteries for the U.S. Army, each battery including 4 launchers with 4 missile cells per launcher for 16 missiles loaded at once, and the company began production of the 4th battery in summer 2025, demonstrating rapid expansion of Typhoon production capacity that could support both U.S. Army deployments and potential foreign military sales to Germany and other NATO allies. The business dimension is significant. For U.S. defense industry, Typhoon contracts with Germany and potentially other European nations represent lucrative deals that expand markets for American weapon systems while deepening European dependence on U.S. military technology. And European officials recognize this, creates long-term interoperability benefits while reducing European strategic autonomy in ways that concern France and other nations pursuing independent European defense capabilities. What genuinely terrifies strategic planners on both sides is how dual-capable launchers create verification and transparency problems that amplify crisis instability beyond what arms control treaties could manage even when they existed. The Mk-41 launcher that Typhoon uses can physically fire nuclear-armed missiles, even though current U.S. policy arms Tomahawks with conventional warheads only, and Russian early warning cannot determine whether Tomahawks detected leaving Germany toward Russia carry conventional high-explosive warheads or W-80 thermonuclear warheads until impact and explosion analysis, meaning Russian commanders must assume worst-case nuclear scenarios and potentially order retaliatory nuclear launches based on possibility rather than confirmation. During Cold War, this exact dual-capable launcher problem drove both superpowers to ban intermediate-range missiles entirely through INF Treaty, because verification could confirm missile types were eliminated but couldn't verify warhead loadouts on remaining systems, creating permanent ambiguity that destabilized crises, and recreating these conditions in 2026 without arms control frameworks or crisis communication mechanisms that existed during détente means both sides are navigating nuclear brinkmanship without guardrails. So here's where we stand in January 2026. The U.S. Army's 312 Field Artillery Battalion is operational in Wiesbaden with Typhoon launchers capable of firing SM-6 missiles 500 kilometers and Tomahawk cruise missiles 2,000 kilometers into Russian territory, with hypersonic weapons arriving that compress flight times to Moscow from 30 minutes to under 10 minutes, while Germany pursues independent purchase of Typhoon systems, creating German-operated strike capabilities separate from American forces. Russia warned European capitals hosting these missiles are legitimate targets and promised mirror countermeasures, including resuming intermediate-range missile production banned under defunct INF Treaty and potential deployments to Belarus, Kaliningrad, or even Cuba, recreating 1962 crisis dynamics. Hypersonic weapons development on both sides creates mutual vulnerabilities where neither can reliably defend against the other's strikes, forcing reliance on launch-on-warning doctrines that delegate nuclear authority to field commanders because political decision-making takes longer than missile flight times allow. Both sides are rebuilding Cold War hair-trigger nuclear confrontation without arms control treaties, crisis hotlines, or verification mechanisms that prevented accidental war during original Cold War, and decision timelines compressed to single-digit minutes mean accidents, technical failures, miscommunications, or rogue actions could trigger nuclear escalation before leaders understand what's happening. And nobody's talking about how simultaneously managing Ukraine war, China-Taiwan tensions, North Korean nuclear threats, and Iran crisis creates probability that one of these multiple crises spirals into catastrophic war higher than any point since Cuban Missile Crisis, except now the missiles are faster, more accurate, and the people making decisions have minutes instead of days to prevent Armageddon.